Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. We are in Paterson, New Jersey today, which is just outside New York City. It's about exit 60 going westbound on I-80. I pass the sign all the time. I know in most of the cities and towns that we find ourselves in on this channel, I always say this small town was such a safe community and there was such a low crime rate. Not so much here. There is a fair amount of crime, as with many metropolitan areas. The victim in today's case is a 29-year-old man named Franklin Pullian. Franklin, who also went by Frankie, started out his life in the workforce, serving in the U.S. military, but was discharged after just 6 months due to a neurological impairment. He returned to New Jersey, where he found employment at a local funeral home, where he did repairs, ran errands, and frequently washed the funeral home's hearse. At 6 a.m. on April 8, 1980, Franklin was tragically found dead, partially under a parked Ford Maverick on a back road. The circumstances of his death were suspicious right off the jump. It had appeared that the person who was driving the car had hit Franklin and then immediately fled the scene, leaving the car parked there in the street. Police began their investigation at the funeral home where Franklin worked, hoping to get some insight on his last day alive. Interestingly, when the police had run the plates on the car that had hit Franklin, they discovered that it had previously been reported stolen by its owner, who happened to be a retired police officer who lived very close by the scene of the crime. He was initially a suspect until, after speaking with him, they found that he had had an alibi on the night of Franklin's death, and he was a senior, so it was extremely unlikely that he had had anything to do with the hit-and-run accident. Investigators had estimated his time of death based on their patrol car logs. They had found that a patrol car had been in the area just around 4 a.m., and the officer inside reported that they did not see Franklin or the car, so the murder would have had to have happened in the very early hours. We know that he was found at 6 a.m., so the window in which this could have occurred was very narrow. They felt they would have no problem solving this case swiftly. What they couldn't quite figure out, though, was why exactly was Franklin out at this hour in this area. He wasn't expected at work at the funeral home until midday, and this area wasn't exactly close on foot. After Franklin was found, police had him transported to the funeral home where he worked to have an autopsy performed. This wasn't all that uncommon in an area that didn't have a morgue to have an autopsy done there by a medical examiner, since many funeral homes were equipped to handle an autopsy, and I'm not sure of the county coroner situation since New Jersey has townships. Basically, your state, if you live in the United States, might be comprised of cities or towns or boroughs, and since a coroner is an elected position, this township might not have had one. Of the current townships that don't all necessarily have active governments, not all city positions are needed or filled. This is why it's important to participate in the census. Remember, this was the 80s. Present-day Passaic County does have a coroner. After being examined by the medical examiner, he concluded that Franklin had died due to massive trauma sustained from the hit-and-run, and determined that his official cause of death was a hit-and-run accident. His injuries were consistent with this conclusion. But the circumstances of the scene were just not adding up to investigators. Right off the bat, they felt that the scene had been staged. Based on where the car had been parked, it was extremely unlikely that the car would have been able to accelerate to such a high speed to hit Franklin and physically go over him. The angle at which Franklin was positioned under the car was also suspect. He was laying under from the waist up, and his legs were positioned up onto the sidewalk. Typically, if you are struck by a car, speed of course is a factor. You would either go over the car and off to the side, or be knocked over in front of the car. I can't figure out how Franklin could have been hit by this car and end up halfway under it. Think about that. From the waist down, he was slightly elevated on the sidewalk. How would he have gotten there if not deliberately placed? It was noted that the type of alleyway this was, there really wasn't enough room for the car to speed up and accelerate to the point where Franklin would have gone under the car and not off to the side. Also, his jacket ended up being found on the other side of the tire. Are you telling me that this car hit him with so much force that it knocked his jacket off his body? Just all around suspicious. As investigators conducted their search of the car, they found no fingerprints on or in the car. There was, however, blood found on the passenger side door frame, as well as on the inside windshield. So the car was wiped down for prints. The steering wheel, the seatbelts, the door handles, but they missed all this blood. Whose blood was it? We can surmise Franklin. But that would point to him, at some point, being inside the car, and since we don't know who was driving, this could be difficult to conclude. Because investigators had taken so many photos of the crime scene, an accident reconstructionist was able to retrace the sequence of events. Notably, he noticed there were no skid marks on the road, indicating that at no point did this car come to a screeching halt or swerve in any way to avoid hitting Franklin. The car itself also appeared to be damage-free. There was no damage to the car's grille or front end, which is inconsistent with striking a pedestrian. In the area of the street behind the car, there were bloody tire tracks. This could have been caused if Franklin had been struck by the car and lodged under, but there wouldn't have been blood behind the car since there was no evidence that he had been dragged. This would seem to point to him as being hit from behind as the car was backing up. Still, this would not cause Franklin to be positioned underneath the car in this way. It was determined based on lack of damage, as well as Franklin's positioning under the car, that this was not the natural result of an accident. They knew based on the blood found inside the car, as well as the blood found on the car's back tires, that this was not consistent with a car collision. It was then that investigators decided they needed to exhume Franklin's body to get another look at his injuries. But this wasn't an easy endeavor. It took more than 3 years for this request to be granted, as his death had already been declared an accident. A pathologist with the state's coroner's office conducted the second autopsy, and she found that the external body surface did not show evidence of any injury. There were no bruises, burns, abrasions, anything to indicate that he was struck and dragged by a car. On the back of Franklin's skull, 4 linear fractures were discovered, and one fracture in particular was a depressed fracture, leading her to believe this was caused by a blow to the head, something inconsistent with being hit by a car. There were also several wood splinters found around this area, which might point to a blunt wooden object, something like a bat or hammer, causing this type of fracture. None of this was ever brought up or documented during the first autopsy. He also sustained no broken ribs, or any broken bones for that matter, which is extremely unusual for someone being hit by a car. Taking all of this into account, the official cause of death went from hit and run accident to homicide. This makes you wonder, how on earth was none of this noted during the initial autopsy report? Were they overlooked or purposely ignored? It was later revealed that the medical examiner who had performed the first autopsy was not a pathologist. They were just a general practitioner who had not been trained in forensic pathology and would have no way of coming to this conclusion without the knowledge of what to look for. It was also discovered that at the funeral home where the first autopsy had been performed, the funeral home director and Franklin's employer, a man named Albert Lee White, decided he would just go ahead and start the autopsy on his own before the medical examiner had even arrived. Like, what? You are not qualified to do that, Mr. White? In fact, the medical examiner had later told police that once he had gotten word that he was needed at the funeral home to perform an autopsy, Albert had called him and was like, "Don't worry, I'll go ahead and get started. So when you get here, I'll already have the organs out." Excuse me, what? At that point, it was highly suspected that the medical examiner did the absolute bare minimum, if that, before writing his report. It is thought that the simple fact that Franklin was found under a car was enough to deem this as a hit-and-run accident. Going back to the scene, the most perplexing question investigators had was how exactly did this blood get inside the car? Upon testing, the blood found on the inside windshield and the passenger side door frame was type O blood, the same blood type as Franklin. This definitely points to Franklin at some point being a passenger in the car. Police began looking more into Franklin's background and found something suspicious. Working as a handyman at the funeral home, Franklin was making anywhere from $7,500 to just under $10,000 a year, but he had 9 life insurance policies totaling $980,000. One of the policies would pay out an additional $350,000 if Franklin was to die in an accident, which, according to the first autopsy report, he did. The question I have was, how was he able to, 1, take out this many policies for this high of an amount, and 2, if he was only making up to $10,000 a year, how was he able to afford the premiums? And this was in the 80s. People today don't have policies adding up to this much. This was definitely pointing to some type of fraud. Definitely something fishy is going on here. Because these policies had been taken out the same year that Franklin died, investigators were very interested in who the policy's beneficiaries were. This might reveal motive and a suspect. One of the beneficiaries was Franklin's boss, Albert. Interesting. I've had many jobs, and I don't think I've had my boss one time as a beneficiary on my life insurance policy. It then came to light that it had been Albert who had purchased the policies in the first place. The fact that he had taken out so many policies, totaling this amount, made him the primary suspect, as he had the most to gain if Franklin were to die in an accident. On one of the policies, the beneficiary was a woman named Erna Boone, who on the policy was listed as Franklin's sister, but a little digging later, it was discovered that Franklin didn't have a sister with this name, and she turned out to be Albert's wife using her maiden name. Some other names that had raised suspicion turned out to be some of Albert's friends named Lawrence Scott and William Brown. On the paperwork, they were listed as Franklin's cousins, but we know this obviously was not true. One of the men had been convicted a few years earlier for fraud, and police believed this might be the case again. The last policy had been taken out just 5 days before Franklin had died. Unbelievable. A document examiner was then called in to look at the signed policies, and sure enough, the signatures on the policies did not match Franklin's known signature or handwriting samples. If you recall, I had mentioned earlier that he had had a neurological impairment which caused his early discharge from the Army, but during the doctor's exams for these insurance policies, which were required when the premiums reached that amount, there was no indication that Franklin had any impairment. This calls into question, was Franklin actually the one being examined? Most likely not. One of the physicians who was conducting the exams remembers when Franklin Pulliam had come in with a stack of cards, and whenever he was asked a question about himself or his lifestyle, he would rifle through his cards as if he didn't know the answer to this simple personal question. This is such an obvious red flag. I don't know why the physician didn't question this further right then and there. My thinking at this point has to be that the physicians just signed off on these policies because maybe things weren't so strict and they just needed a physical person to be there and they just signed off on the paperwork. I don't know, it was the 80s. I know it sounds like I'm trying to make excuses for these people and defend these doctors, but believe you me, I certainly am not. In fact, I would like to see some consequences for these people too. Anyway, Albert was then questioned as to why he was listed as the beneficiary on all these policies of his employee, and he did admit to purchasing them, but he was adamant that he had absolutely nothing to do with Franklin's death. Likely story. While researching this case, I did find a newspaper article from 1975 where the state of New Jersey had stripped Albert of his certification to conduct funerals because of unethical business practices, including charging up to 4 times the cost for caskets. It was reported by the New York Times that this revocation was permanent, but Albert was somehow able to repair his reputation in business just a few years later. Soon after reports of this were resurrected, a witness had come forward and said on the night before Franklin's murder, she remembers seeing a Ford Maverick, the very same car that had hit Franklin, in the parking lot of Albert's funeral home. Based on the evidence, which was the blood found on the interior of the car, it is believed that one of these 4 people, Albert, Erna, Lawrence, or William, had lured Franklin inside the car, and once inside, he was hit on the head with a blunt object, most likely with a bat or hammer. He would have been killed instantly by the impact. He was then dragged out of the car and placed on the ground behind the car, and whoever was driving had backed the car up over him, which is why there was blood in the tire tracks behind the car, and the scene was set. Albert knew that because the town didn't have a coroner, Franklin's body would go straight to his funeral home to have his autopsy performed, that he knew he'd be able to alter. The medical examiner who had performed the first autopsy never went to the crime scene, never looked at any crime scene photos, never spoke to any police officers. All of the things one would expect to conduct a proper autopsy. Albert knew that there would be little to no investigation since he had worked with this medical examiner before, and in the past, he had apparently started the autopsy by himself many times, so doing this now wouldn't raise suspicion. And it didn't. It is believed that Albert was the mastermind behind this whole plan. I hate using that word for such a terrible person. It is believed that Albert had been the mastermind behind this whole plan and had been extensively planning it from the very moment he met and employed Franklin. Albert, along with his wife and friends Lawrence and William, needed a victim who was single, who didn't have any family in the area, someone that no one would come looking for, and no one would ask questions. Albert Lee White, Erna White, Lawrence Scott, and William Brown were all charged with murder and insurance fraud. A disturbing article I found had Albert quoted as saying business at his funeral home had increased since the indictment. I mean, do you really want to tell people that at your funeral home, business is booming? You are being accused of murder. During the trial, they all said that there was no physical evidence connecting them to Franklin's murder, and investigators seemed to agree. However, the overwhelming circumstantial evidence left no question. The multiple insurance policies totaling almost $1 million, along with the car from the staged crime scene being identified as being at the funeral home where Albert was the proprietor, amounted to too much to overlook. On January 18th, 1985, after a 47-day trial, after all being found guilty of first-degree murder and insurance fraud, Albert Lee White was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Lawrence Scott and William Brown were also sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Erna White was convicted of fraud and theft by deception and was only sentenced to probation. While incarcerated in Trenton State Prison in 1990, Albert had gotten in trouble for trying to solicit a false confession out of another inmate in exchange for a sports car. Because of this, an additional 5 years were added to his sentence. In 2013, Albert had been denied parole after a third attempt. The parole board felt that while he continued to adhere to a version of events that downplayed his culpable actions, they felt that he had not shown rehabilitation progress after the 28 years he had already served. Albert Lee White died on May 22, 2019, in a Washington, D.C. hospital. Lawrence ended up being released from prison in 2001, but had returned back that same year. As of right now, his current Department of Correction status is listed as paroled. I don't have an update on William, because he has such a common name and there are many in the system, I wouldn't want to give the wrong information, but I would guess that he is released or on parole. As far as I was able to tell, Erna is still living in New Jersey and she is most likely retired. When she wasn't committing fraud, she worked as a school teacher. So need a break from that. Franklin Pulliam is buried at Fair Lawn Memorial Cemetery in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. I feel like everyone involved got off way too easy, especially Erna, who slid by on probation. They purposely sought out someone with no family close by to commit this crime because they thought no one would care. I care. And I feel like if you're watching at this point, you care too. Absolutely heartbreaking that they took advantage of this sweet, hardworking man who wouldn't have assumed his employer, who he also considered a friend, would do such a heartless thing to him. Let me know your thoughts on this one. And just because you feel you don't have anybody doesn't mean that you don't have anybody. I feel like, especially nowadays, friends are family, and you'll always have someone in your corner. And if your boss tries to take out an insurance policy for you, it is time to seek new employment. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.